Every species remembered the beginning of its rise, the moments that shaped its history, the wars that carved empires into the fabric of the galaxy. Yet long before the day humanity broke, few remembered Earth at all. Humans had entered the interstellar stage late, long after the old powers had risen, stagnated, and solidified into unshakable dominance. To them, humanity was another oddity, another culture to catalogue, another ally too small to fear and too fragile to matter. And so the galaxy watched them with a mixture of condescension and curiosity, not respect. The great federations tolerated humanity because tolerance costs little. They permitted them to keep Earth, their cradle, a blue and green jewel that other species admired from orbit but never feared. When humans stretched into the stars, building colonies with slow, earnest hands, the galaxy saw only naivety. Then Quora would whisper that humans wasted too much on art when they could have invested in industry. The Targathi claimed humans were a people too bound by emotion to survive. Even allies, those who found value in trade or exchange, quietly regarded humanity as quaint, admirable in spirit but irrelevant in power. For humans, that dismissal was no insult. They had survived their own millennia of wars, their fragile ecosystems, and their self-inflicted scars. They did not hunger for conquest, they sought to prove themselves through endurance. They came bearing songs, literature, and offers of cooperation. They filled alien marketplaces with laughter and instruments. Their embassies resonated with voices rather than threats. In the eyes of the wider galaxy, that patience, that endless search for understanding, appeared almost embarrassing. Where others stood proud of their scars, humans seemed intent on hiding theirs beneath smiles. Yet behind the laughter lay fragility, or so the other species believed. They saw how humans mourned their dead, how they clung to memory. An corps officer once said, "They bury their grief in the ground rather than in victory." How could such a people ever endure real war? It was a common belief. Humanity, it was said, felt too deeply. Their tears were proof of weakness. Their longing for peace was interpreted as surrender. Their fragile bodies, shorter lived than many, seemed a curse that condemned them to insignificance. Still, there were others who watched more carefully. Among the archives of the Veyrak, one scholar noted, "Of all species, the humans endure disappointment with a strange resilience. They fold. They bend. They break, yet they return, almost stubbornly, as if retreat were only preparation." His words were overlooked at the time, buried in dusty records. No one yet understood what he had glimpsed. What unsettled the most observant was not humanity's weakness but its persistence. They suffered, yet they did not vanish. When colonies were struck by famine, they rebuilt. When trade was denied, they scavenged and invented. When fleets intimidated them into concessions, they complied outwardly but quietly expanded their reach in other directions. Humans seemed to absorb pressure, to swallow humiliation, as if waiting. And waiting. And waiting. It was easy for the dominant empires to dismiss such behavior. After all, patience was not power. Patience was merely the absence of defiance. And so, humanity was pressed harder with every generation. A world was taxed into poverty. Another was stripped of resources under the guise of shared development. When humans resisted, they were reminded of their fragility, reminded of how easily their fleets could be shattered. And each time, they submitted. They endured. The galaxy turned its eyes elsewhere, confident they had seen humanity's full measure. But even as they dismissed them, they could not help but notice the stories humans told. Their music carried grief heavier than steel. Their literature spoke of loss so profound it unsettled even the battle-born Targathi. A soldier of that warlike species once admitted, "Their poems frighten me more than their weapons. They grieve in ways I cannot understand. It is as if they prepare for some storm only they can see." Across the galaxy, cultures began to whisper of humanity as dreamers cursed with fragility. They were tolerated, pitied, sometimes admired, but never feared. They were too earnest, too trusting, too fragile to be dangerous. They were a species that wept at funerals and sang lullabies for their children even as colonies burned. Yet always, beneath it all, was that quiet question that no one dared to answer: what would happen if they stopped singing? Some dismissed the thought immediately. Humans without their songs would not be human at all. Others laughed, imagining it was impossible. But among the careful historians and the few veterans who had fought beside human soldiers, the question lingered like a shadow. They had seen the moments when laughter died, when human eyes grew cold and determined. They had seen soldiers march without sleep, scientists build with impossible speed, and families refuse to yield even when all seemed lost. A broken people, perhaps, but a people who did not vanish when broken. Instead, they reshaped themselves. The galaxy had not yet understood the truth, that endurance can look like weakness, that patience can look like surrender, and that silence can be far more dangerous than rage. It had not yet seen what happens when humans finally stop waiting. For all the countless wars etched into the annals of history, for all the conquests celebrated by the proud and the mighty, none of them would be remembered so fiercely as the day humanity ceased to endure and began to break. And no species, not even those who had lived through their own apocalypses, could yet imagine what would come of that moment. The pressure on humanity did not come all at once. It arrived like tides, each wave heavier than the last, eroding patience grain by grain. At first, it was resource skirmishes, mining colonies disputed by stronger powers, contracts rewritten under threat of military presence. Humanity responded with negotiation, yielding ground rather than risking open conflict. The great powers interpreted this as proof of weakness. To them, it confirmed that humans would never rise against the weight of the galaxy. Decades passed, and each cycle brought sharper demands. Colonies on the fringes were stripped bare under claims of shared prosperity. Earth's supply lines were squeezed until hunger became a recurring wound across human settlements. Refugees spilled from lost stations and burned outposts, carrying with them the same stories, fleets arriving without warning, demands issued at gunpoint, and treaties torn as though promises meant nothing. Each humiliation carved deep scars, yet humanity did not retaliate with the fury expected of other species. They absorbed each blow, stitched wounds with stubborn hands, and carried on. Among alien strategists, this pattern became doctrine: pressure the humans, and they will yield. Many envoys described them as pliable, a species that bends to survive. Their patience was interpreted as passivity. And yet beneath the surface, something quiet was building. Generations grew up knowing nothing but compromise. Entire families were displaced across the stars, resettled after their homes were seized or destroyed. Earth itself remained a sanctuary, but even there, citizens lived with the shadow of encroachment. Every broadcast carried news of another lost colony. Children learned early that maps could not be trusted. Borders were drawn by others, erased overnight. For most species, such constant erosion of sovereignty would spark revolution. For humans, it produced a grim familiarity, a culture that normalized loss. But with each loss came another layer of pressure building against the dam of restraint. Some alien observers noticed the contradiction. They saw humanity's suffering and expected collapse, yet collapse never came. Instead, the humans adapted with a relentlessness that defied logic. When food was scarce, they learned to grow crops in inhospitable soil. When resources were seized, they scavenged and engineered substitutes. When trade routes were cut, they built new ones in secret corridors of space, guided by ships too small and too swift to be intercepted. They endured in ways the galaxy struggled to comprehend. Still, endurance has its limits. The old empires had forgotten that patience is not infinite. They believed they could grind humanity into compliance forever. The mistake lay not in recognizing human resilience but in underestimating the cost of their grief. Each concession created not only bitterness but also memory. Each insult engraved itself into the collective identity of a people who never forgot. Across human settlements, cultural expression shifted. Songs once filled with hope became laments. Stories passed to children were no longer tales of discovery but of survival under oppression. Even in laughter, there was an undertone of sorrow, a weight that did not fade. To outside observers, this was dismissed as harmless, ritual mourning, perhaps even catharsis. They did not understand that it was preparation, that the very act of remembering kept old wounds alive. Empires grew careless. They mocked humanity's caution, exploited their negotiations, demanded more with each treaty. Each cycle of humiliation seemed to confirm the same belief: humans would never rise. Yet the more they pressed, the more they unknowingly forged unity among those who had once been scattered by distance and division. Colonies thousands of light years apart shared the same pain, and in that shared pain lay the foundation of something the galaxy had not yet seen: a species whose patience had been stretched to breaking, bound together by memory as much as by blood. The final years before the break were the cruelest. Treaties were signed only to be betrayed. A generation born under constant retreat grew into adulthood with no illusions left. For them, peace was not trust, it was waiting for the next betrayal. What the galaxy failed to see was how this cynicism hardened resolve. No species can endure forever without changing, and humanity was changing in silence. The question whispered by a few scholars became louder in hidden corners: what happens when humans no longer endure? They had withstood famine, betrayal, occupation, and still they had not fallen. Patience had kept them alive, but patience had limits, and the dam of restraint was beginning to crack. Empires looked upon their compliance, and mistook it for endless submission. They failed to understand the law of pressure, that when glass shatters, it does not yield in pieces, it explodes outward with unstoppable force. No species realized that every injustice, every scar, every stolen world was not just a wound but kindling. All that remained was the spark. It began with a silence that terrified those who knew humanity best. For decades, every injustice had been met with speeches, protests, or appeals. Even as their colonies were stripped away, humans still argued, still pleaded, still sang. But then came the betrayal that tore the final thread. An undefended settlement, promised protection under treaty, was annihilated without warning. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, families, workers, children, erased in fire. When the survivors' signals reached Earth, no reply left its surface. The usual appeals never came. The galaxy waited for the familiar cycle: mourning, negotiation, reluctant compromise. None arrived. Instead, there was only silence. At first, powers accustomed to exploiting humanity mistook it for surrender. They congratulated themselves on finally breaking the species that had resisted with nothing but words and patience. But others, the few who had fought beside humans in forgotten campaigns, felt dread. They understood what silence meant. Humanity did not announce its break. It simply broke. The shift was immediate yet invisible to outsiders. On Earth, industries turned overnight. Factories once devoted to agriculture, transport, and entertainment shifted to production without hesitation. Colonies long scattered and neglected began to coordinate as though responding to a signal only they could hear. Plans hidden in archives, strategies whispered between generations of officers, emerged in full. What had once seemed like a species stumbling in disunity became something altogether different, focus sharpened to a single point. The first signs reached the stars in weeks. A fleet appeared not in defense, but in assault, targeting the very empire responsible for the massacre. Ships that had been considered antiquated struck with precision, outfitted with weapons no observer expected them to possess. Entire stations fell before their enemies could react. Alien analysts scrambled to explain the sudden leap. They whispered of outside technology, of secret alliances, of impossible innovation. None of them understood that it was not technology that had changed, but humanity itself. The rage was not wild, not reckless. It was cold. Where other species lashed out with uncontrolled fury, humans advanced with deliberate purpose. Their silence had been preparation. Every resource was poured into the war effort without hesitation. Scientists worked without rest, engineers turned desperation into invention, civilians gave willingly because all of them carried the memory of betrayal. There was no resistance from within, no debate, no hesitation. Humanity moved as though bound by one will. What frightened the galaxy most was the efficiency. In generations past, humans had begged for negotiation, now they offered none. Cities were captured, garrisons annihilated, fleets dismantled methodically. Opponents expected mercy, but none came. The very patience that had once defined them had shattered. Where once they had sung songs of peace, they advanced in silence broken only by the thunder of their weapons. Alien commanders who faced them reported the same realization: humans fought not for victory, but for permanence. They did not drive enemies back, they erased them. They dismantled supply lines, shattered infrastructures, burned through command structures with terrifying precision. They fought as though they had waited centuries for this moment, as though every scar carried across generations had become a blade. Among allied species, whispers spread of a transformation unlike any seen before. One diplomat wrote, "They have ceased to be negotiators. They have ceased to be dreamers. Humanity has chosen war as their final language, and they speak it with fluency that terrifies the stars." The same voices that once pitted them now trembled at their advance. The phrase began to circulate, and then humanity broke. It was not spoken with triumph or scorn, but with awe. Empires that had dismissed them now recalled every insult, every treaty betrayed, and wondered which would be remembered when humanity's judgment arrived. Their silence was not weakness. It was the silence of a storm's eye before devastation. The first campaign ended in weeks, an empire that had once mocked humanity reduced to ruins. Yet even as its fleets burned, humans did not celebrate. There were no songs, no broadcasts of triumph. Only preparation for the next target. Their fury was relentless, but it was not chaos, it was inevitability. In that moment, the galaxy finally understood what had always been hidden beneath patience. The break had come, and what emerged was not the fragile species they had mocked but something no power had imagined, a people whose will, once unbound, carried the weight of centuries of endurance behind it. From that day forward, the words carried through every star system: humanity had broken, and the galaxy would never be the same. The campaigns that followed spread faster than even the most seasoned strategists could comprehend. Where other species required decades to mobilize, humans transformed their entire civilization within months. Fleets multiplied in hidden shipyards, new technologies emerged from laboratories with impossible speed, and weapons that should have taken generations to perfect were fielded with brutal effectiveness. Every world, every station, every scattered settlement moved as if part of a single organism, united by memory and wrath. Their methods bewildered their enemies. They did not waste time with posturing or demands. They struck, dismantled, and moved on, leaving nothing behind that could be rebuilt. Logistics, once humanity's weakness, became their greatest weapon. They converted asteroids into fuel depots, hollowed moons into armories, and ensured that no fleet advanced without an endless chain of support. Where alien empires faltered under their own bureaucracy, humans thrived in improvisation. If a weapon was needed, it was built. If a path was blocked, it was bypassed. The galaxy had never seen war waged with such ruthless adaptability. Their unity was as frightening as their innovation. Once, humanity had been divided by nations, corporations, and ideology. Now those divisions no longer existed. Entire cultures fused under a single determination. Colonists who had never seen Earth now spoke of it as sacred ground. Soldiers who had never met shared the same discipline, the same silence, the same unshakable will. In war councils across the galaxy, this was the most terrifying revelation: humanity had stopped being a collection of colonies. They had become one force. Enemies who once viewed them as pliable quickly discovered there would be no negotiations. Armies that surrendered were disbanded and scattered across uninhabited space, stripped of their ability to regroup. Strongholds thought impregnable fell with startling precision. Human fleets learned every weakness, studied every tactic, and adapted before their opponents could react. Even the most warlike species struggled to keep pace, finding themselves outmaneuvered by those they once called fragile. What unnerved their enemies most was the relentlessness. Humans did not retreat. They did not pause to consolidate victories. They pressed forward with the inevitability of a collapsing star, crushing resistance wherever it arose. Entire regions of space that had once belonged to the proudest empires were reduced to silence. Populations who had once mocked humanity now whispered their name as if invoking a storm. In every conquered territory, The same stories spread, fleets arriving without warning, battles concluded in hours, infrastructure dismantled so completely that recovery became impossible. Humanity was not conquering, they were dismantling. No enemy was permitted to retain the power to rise again. To those who watched, it became clear that this was not vengeance for a single massacre but justice for centuries of humiliation. Every betrayal, every insult, every scar carved into their history was being repaid with interest. The effect on the wider galaxy was immediate. Species uninvolved in the oppression of humanity began to withdraw, desperate not to attract attention. Trade routes emptied, embassies shuttered, and entire sectors went dark, fearing the approach of fleets that no defense could halt. Historians began to whisper of inevitability, of the moment when a patient people decides endurance is no longer enough. Within human ranks, there was no celebration. Victories were acknowledged only with preparations for the next campaign. Their silence persisted, a silence more frightening than any declaration. Mercy, once the defining trait of their diplomacy, was gone. The very endurance that had once been mistaken for weakness had transformed into implacable determination. No plea softened their advance, no surrender slowed their momentum. Other species who had once dominated through fear now tasted it themselves. Where once they had ridiculed humans as too emotional, too fragile, they now saw a people who fought with precision colder than steel. The irony was not lost on the galaxy. Those who had mocked human tears now begged before human silence. By the time the campaigns reached their height, even those who had never crossed humanity began to record warnings in their archives. They described a new law of the stars, that no people, no matter how patient, should ever be driven to breaking. Humanity's rise was no sudden miracle, it was the release of centuries of restrained fury. And as their fleets expanded further into the void, the truth became undeniable. The galaxy was no longer shaped by the old empires. It was being reshaped by the species that had once been dismissed as fragile. Their endurance had ended. Their wrath had begun. When the last campaigns ended, the galaxy was left in a silence heavier than any battlefield. The empires that had once lorded over weaker species no longer existed in their former shapes. Borders carved over millennia had been erased in the span of years. Star systems once considered untouchable were empty husks, their rulers scattered, their pride ground into dust. Humanity did not claim their thrones, it dismantled them, ensuring no one could wield them again. Victory did not resemble conquest. It resembled erasure. What followed was not celebration. Humanity held no parades, built no monuments to their triumphs, and offered no speeches of glory. Instead, they built memorials for the fallen, not just for their own but for every world that had suffered under the weight of betrayal. Where others would have raised banners, humans raised stone and silence. To them, the war had never been about dominance, it had been about survival paid for in grief too deep for jubilation. Their wrath had burned, but when the flames receded, only mourning remained. The galaxy remembered differently. Among alien archives, new doctrines formed: never provoke humanity, never assume patience means weakness, and never confuse mercy with helplessness. Historians debated endlessly, yet they all agreed on one point: that what had emerged after the break was unprecedented. A species defined by restraint had revealed the cost of pressing restraint too far. In their attempt to grind humans into submission, the empires had forged something unstoppable. Testimonies spread from survivors of defeated fleets. They spoke of eyes that did not blink in fear, of fleets that advanced with mechanical precision, of silence that was more suffocating than any war cry. Commanders who once laughed at human fragility described them now as inevitability incarnate. Soldiers who had believed themselves invincible admitted they had faced not an enemy but judgment itself. The galaxy listened, and it did not forget. Generations later, the phrase endured, the day humans finally broke. It became legend, a reference point for every people who sought to understand the balance between endurance and fury. For some, it was a warning written into law. For others, it was a tale of awe, proof that even the most underestimated species could change the course of history. The words carried both reverence and fear, for no one who studied the records could escape the truth that humanity's wrath had reshaped the stars. And yet, what unsettled the galaxy most was not their victory but their choice afterward. Humanity did not expand endlessly, did not enslave, did not demand tribute. They withdrew, rebuilt, and carried their silence with them. The fire had been extinguished, but its memory remained bright enough to illuminate every corner of the galaxy. In restraint they had been dismissed. In fury they had been unstoppable. In the aftermath they were unknowable. Among alien philosophers, debates continued without end. Some claimed humanity's nature was dual, that of compassion capable of infinite patience, and wrath capable of infinite destruction. Others argued there was no contradiction, that their fury was only the shadow of their mercy. The deeper the galaxy studied them, the less it understood. But one truth stood above all else: no other people had endured so much before breaking, and no other had risen so high once broken. Monuments were raised not by humans but by those who had witnessed their rise. On distant worlds, great stones were carved with warnings in every known language: do not break them, for the cost is beyond reckoning. Pilgrims traveled to these sites, some to honor, others to tremble, all to remember. In time, even children of species untouched by the wars grew up knowing the phrase as if it were carved into their own bloodlines. The galaxy had seen countless wars, countless extinctions, countless empires. But none left such a scar on memory as humanity's break. For what shook the stars was not merely their victory, but the revelation it carried, that the most dangerous force in existence was not strength, nor technology, nor ancient power. It was the will of a species that endures until endurance ends, and when it ends, nothing can stand in its way. From that day forward, every strategist, every ruler, every scholar carried the same thought in the back of their minds: patience is precious, and patience can be fatal. And when they spoke of humanity, it was always in whispers, with a mixture of reverence and fear. For no species could forget, and no species ever would.